thanks everybody for being here. Definitely thank you, Shawnee and Rizwan, for carving out time to be our experts in today's Data First Forum. So with that, I can't think of a better way to break the ice or defrost the turkey, I think would be the appropriate way to say it now, and get us started, than by talking about like what causes insider threats. So I'll throw the first question at you, Shawnee. What are the common causes of insider threats?
So first you have to look at the categories. There are essentially three categories of insider threats. You've got the unintentional or the negligent. People don't know policies, or they're taking shortcuts even if they know a policy. They're accidentally clicking on a link. Then you've got the compromised insiders. And then you've got, that's where the hackers and the attackers are basically taking advantage of those negligent insiders. And then you've got the malicious. So depending on the different types of category you're talking about, most often the biggest category is that negligent or compromised. So when you're looking at that category, you have to understand that because people have access, within your systems, they know policies, they know procedures. Well, they should, right? That inherent access doesn't always necessarily trip up alarms, especially if they're doing something in the course of their normal duties. Another problem is that people have too much access, period. There are organizations that consistently give people just the keys to the kingdom, and they don't realize that they don't need that access. I come from a government background, and we keep things need to know, and that's really difficult for private sector nowadays to kind of handle and stomach. Sometimes people want to know everything. And then I think also you really have to look at disgruntlement in general, looking at workplace culture, looking at organizational culture, understanding why training and awareness plays such a key part in educating people to report suspicious or concerning behaviors. All of that plays in. And if you don't have the culture that really encourages that and makes it safe for people to do, you're not going to have a lot of reporting. So that disgruntlement can lead to a lot of the malicious acts as well. So that's a lot in a little nutshell.
Yeah, and Shawnee, before we were preparing for today's session, I remember talking about this and kind of talking about your background, and you were really passionate about the human intelligence side of identifying insider threats. Could you expand a little bit for our audience and maybe even tell us a little more about your background and kind of why you feel so strongly about that?
Yeah, I eat, sleep, and breathe this. I kind of joke about that, but I really do. So I used to be an intelligence officer. I was, if you watch movies, you'd call me a spy, but I was a spy recruiter, a spy handler. And so I went from a career of recruiting vulnerable insiders, leveraging people's motivations and vulnerabilities to commit espionage. That's a pretty heavy malicious insider act, right? But in doing that for so long and understanding how motivations and vulnerabilities play a key role in what people are doing, I just realized that you can have the greatest tools in the world and you can have a super sexy program, but if you don't have the foundations, which is your people, understanding how they leave you vulnerable or what maybe the little shortcuts they're doing leave you vulnerable, you're not going to really have much success. So,
and
yeah,
I don't want to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to steal too much from. I know we're going to talk later about tips and tricks.
Yeah.
But you also said something there. I'd ask you to expand on, which is you talked about like the importance of culture. And I think about culture, and I'm sure our audience does. We think about like, well, our company's culture is, to do right by the customer and to work hard. Or our company's culture is to be honest and dedicated to the cause, or maybe we support the mission. You also talked a little bit though about security culture and this concept of like having to kind of tell people that it is their job to do it. Can you expand a little bit on like the role of culture and kind of like how that either causes or could prevent an insider threat?
Yeah, 100%. That's a great question. So look back to September 11th. Okay, this is the best analogy I have. And after September 11th, when those attacks occurred, American culture changed. See something, say something became the norm. We're okay with it. Before that happened, people would have been like, what are you talking about? So having the ability to have your organization embrace reporting and safe reporting and confidential reporting is just so critical. I've been in a lot of situations in my career where I had to report things, but it wasn't safe. There was retaliation. It wasn't confidential. And so you have to look back and recognize that your employees see each other and deal with each other on a daily or near daily basis. It's not HR, it's not always the manager, right? So to enable them and give them the tools to recognize when someone's pattern of behavior has changed, that they should feel safe to not feel like a narc or a tattletale. They're not throwing their friend under the bus. With what's going on in the world today, you don't know if it's suicidal ideation or potential workplace violence or any number of things. And so instead of saying, well, he had a new baby, he probably just didn't get sleep last night, don't judge a book by its cover and actually report so that the organization can intervene and offer EAP support or can do a risk assessment or what's needed.
Yeah, thanks. And Rizwan, I want to make sure that we include you in this too. We talked a little bit about, like, in terms of causes of insiders, like the different kinds, like the malicious insider and the negligent insider. And we talked about the unintentional even insider threat. We talked a little bit about, like, why does it happen? Well, people just have too much access to stuff that they don't need. What else causes insider threats from your perspective?
I think Shawnee hit it right on the head. It is culture. In a lot of cases, we'll probably get to this in a little bit too. For example, remember Robert Hansen, the FBI guy who was insider threat. He was driven. I mean, look at FBI's culture, right? It's always about integrity, honesty, do the right thing. But he was driven by personal gain from a financial perspective, right? And so culture is a big thing. But on the flip side of that, if you do a lessons learned on that, they knew something was going on for like 10 to 15 years ahead, and no one had the courage to really confront him because he was a senior guy in the FBI. And they just kept sweeping this stuff under the rug. And then, 10, 15 years passed by, and it's one of the largest breaches in the history of the US, and it goes to a nation state of Russia, right? So culture is a big thing. We also held an FBI active shooter event here recently in my company, and that's on the physical side. But there was a key component to pick up from those discussions, and Shawnee hit that on the head as well. Is be kind to people, and if you feel like there's something off with somebody, go talk to them. And now you start talking about, like, your kids that are in school or getting bullied, right? You need to confront that and ask, hey, what is going on? Like, why are you being bullied? And even from the bully's perspective, like, ask them, hey, what is driving you towards this behavior? You want to have an inclusive environment, because you start isolating people or not even confronting them to learn and listen about their problems, they're going to feel isolated, and then that's going to drive them to do the wrong thing.
Can I add something too, to just
absolutely,
piggyback on what Riz was saying? I love the talking angle, right? So a lot of us are still work from home. We're still behind that monitor. And I think it's difficult for a lot of people to overcome that hurdle of having a genuine conversation. So you can get into that meeting and you'd be like, all right, you're good, kids good. Okay, let's get into work. But instead, take the time to find out how people truly are. When we talk about unintentional or negligent insider threat, think about all the stressors and the competing priorities every single one of us has in our life, right? Kids, sick kids, admin, family admin, work, all of these things going on. And so if you take the time to really just get in the weeds and get to know what's going on, you can be that support system for somebody that needs it. Or you can, if they're too fearful to say, like in the government, nobody ever said, like, I'm having mental health issues. Would we ever do that? But nowadays it's getting a little bit easier. So if someone's struggling, you can say, let me help you. Let me get you to the right person for resources or things like that. You have to reach across that screen.
And Rizwan, you brought up just now an example of, like, a pretty significant insider threat. Another one that comes to mind for me is Joshua Schulte. And I know, Shawnee, this was one that you had some background on, and you're pretty passionate about too. For our audience that maybe, like, let's just assume there are people here that have never heard about that case, or really either one of these cases. Yeah. Could you tell everybody the story and a little bit about, like, what it means, or what the industry could learn from that?
Yeah. So the Joshua Schulte case is a classic example of culture and culture issues. So, and we can get into later, but employment lifecycle management is critical too. But this was a like a software engineer. He worked for the CIA in a very small office here in Northern Virginia. And the office environment, while everyone thought it was fun and they were pranksters and they'd shot each other with Nerf guns and they called each other names, this guy took everything incredibly personally. In fact, they gave him the nickname nuclear option, if that tells you anything. But his relationship with his peers kind of devolved so badly, he ended up leaving. He left about 4 months after leaving. He moved to New York. That's when Wikipedia leaked what the New York Times calls basically the largest dump of CIA documents in history. And it was all from his little shop and all the tools and software and things that they were using to spy on people. But the reason that's important, number one, is the prosecution said that his motivation was spite. So that shows you how the culture, that the organization was aware that he was unhappy. And whether he was a problem child or not, when somebody is disgruntled and unhappy, it has to be addressed, because you can see he was allowed to walk down that critical pathway until he committed that malicious act.
And Rizwan, when you think about the example that you brought up, just to kind of revisit that, or even expand on Joshua Schulte, when we look at these cases where there's this timeline, right? I think some of the things that our audience is probably thinking about is like, well, when do I do something? Like I already saw a couple of questions and comments come in the chat with like, hey, there's always this concern about like speaking up. Like, when do you have enough to speak up? You guys, I'm sure this is subjective. I'm sure every situation is different, but could you guys maybe share a few situations where you would encourage someone to speak up, or, when you have enough of these indicators?
Yeah, from my perspective, I mean, I tell my staff, you got to speak up, especially in the IT and cyber world, right? We're really introverts. We want to just geek out on the technology and all that. But this is where your relationships matter, right? If you have a good relationship with your HR department, finance department, legal department, when you feel that something is off, follow your gut. I mean, most likely your instinct's not going to be wrong, and then engage outside partners. Go to HR and say, hey, I think something's off with this person. What do you recommend we do? Shawnee hit EAP earlier. Do you need an employee assistance program where maybe we can engage them, see what's going on in their personal life or professional life to start driving that engagement? At least then you could kind of step back out, let other parties kind of evaluate, and then they'll come back to you and say, you know what, Riz, you were right. Let's start investigating this. And this is where then your insider threat program kicks in, right? Start digging through logs, forensics analysis. And this is where the whole risk-based authentication model also comes into play too, right? And we'll probably dive into that a little bit, but essentially it's always behavior, right? Technology is always going to be the last thing you want to even attack. I mean, that's going to be your foundational layer to reinforce your forensics investigation, but you got to follow your instincts.
And I want to push you a little bit on that, Riz. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about okay, so if we're doing this, we're talking about things we should do, when we should make the call. Maybe we could even move into a little bit about how do we actually get a program started, right? I know we're super focused on the micro. I even have things I want to say about what are some of the signs of an insider that you could catch. But let's come back to that. When we're thinking about building an insider threat program, how would you start one? How would you improve one? We'll start with you, Riz, and then Shawnee, of course, we want to hear from you on this too.
So in my world, I'm in the DoD space, right? We do a lot of Navy work. So in that space, it kind of helps. Is I always lean on regulatory bodies. Our Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, DCSA, is an audit agency that audits us, and they're driving us to build these insider threat programs. So I always lean on the regulatory and audit agencies to drive your agenda home. I mean, even on the commercial side of the house, right? If you're in the financial sector, you're going to follow some sort of standard, SEC standard or whatnot, where you can start pulling so you have some teeth and get buy-in. So when I'm going to the executive staff, I'm like, I need money. I need to build out this program. And they're going to ask why. You just wave that piece of paper. It's like, hey, these are the guys that are auditing us. There's going to be potential gaps here. And we got to do it, because then you may get fined or you may be out of business, which is going to cost you a lot more. So I always keep that in my back pocket, right? It has more teeth. You got to lean on standards as well. I mean, if you're following any sort of NIST 853 or 171, Those all have components of insider threats, and you can't build any program without mapping your program out to a standard or a framework, right? So, and you start pulling that narrative out of there, and you start driving your agenda from that perspective. Another thing I do want to add too is like, this is where Shawnee may come into place. I may call her or somebody else that's in this world and say, you know what, I need you to come in here and give me reinforcements. It's like the case of your kid, right? Like you're telling them not to do something, they'll continue to do it, but they'll hear it from their friends, parents not to do something, and they'll stop, right? So this is where the community helps you, your partnerships and your relationships tremendously help you to drive your agenda to start building something.
And Shawnee, I want to kind of hear what you have to say on that. But before you do, I want to echo a point that Riz made at the beginning, which he started with. We do a lot of business with, and then named the Navy, a military body, right? That's what I think everyone in our audience should take away, right? Is like, what business are you trying to protect? If you're trying to go to your senior leaders and say, I need to protect from threats better, it needs to be more like, hey, like, got a lot of people and a lot of contracts, a lot of auditors looking at this stuff. I think we could really do better at finding people inside our network that are, violating some of these things that we have. And you even come with examples. And it's when you have that business context, at least me personally, I find that people want to listen because they're like, oh, you mean this revenue stream that I rely on? That's really important to the company. You need to do more to protect it. Okay, I'm listening. I'm already invested. I was already invested in what you had to say when you opened with that.
Yeah, money talks, right? And numbers in general talk. If you need to get buy-in and you need support for a program like this, you have to come with numbers. And the problem is with insider threat, it's like the hardest thing to quantify, right? How do I prove all the bad things that have happened when we're not catching them all, number one? The ones we're catching, most of the time, organizations can't put a price on it. What was it worth? I don't know. Should those people have had access? I don't know. It's really hard to do that. So I'd say the first step is pulling metrics from all of your various investigations teams, talking with HR, finding out where the pain points are. Are you losing a bunch of people to terminations for one specific reason? Are people in their exit interviews saying they're miserable about career growth or what have you? Take every metric you can and leverage those to the best of your ability. I'll add also, you really, really should do I call it a human risk assessment or insider threat vulnerability assessment, where somebody comes in and they look at your organization top to bottom. I will look at your policies, your procedures, your playbooks, your governance. I will see if maybe you've got a data classification policy, which if you don't, you should, by the way, and you should enforce it. Maybe you've got that, but no one in your organization has ever heard of it. Nobody's classified one document in their life. That's a problem. This assessment will look at what you're doing well, but where your biggest vulnerabilities lie within that human risk. It gets heavy in the weeds of psychology. It gets into morale. So I would start there if you're doing any sort of wanting to build a program. Also, from that, I would build up your policies, your procedures, your governance, make sure everything's ticking all the right boxes, because you're probably going to have a lot of loopholes. People can get away with a lot when they read a policy. They're like, well, it didn't say I couldn't do this. And then have things like a working group. Somebody made a comment in the chat where they were saying that they might bring stuff up to HR or legal, but HR and legal oftentimes is a bit of a web where you have trouble getting through. So having really senior leaders from HR, ER, legal, security, IT, NSEC, all these teams, and having them do a continual working group where you're going through insider threat case studies from your organization, talking about how you'd improve when something happened. It gets that buy-in where they're truly understanding why you need them to push things through when you do. So those are kind of the big things. And then every time you let me talk, I'll probably talk about training and awareness, because we have to get everybody on the same page to understand what the threats are.
Well, we're certainly going to let you talk more, Shawnee. We really are enjoying it so far. I'll speak on behalf of all of our audience, and even Riz, I see him enjoying it as well. Let's launch a quick poll. I know we have a bunch of polls queued up. So let's launch a quick poll, see if anybody in the audience can get that one. Give you guys a chance to catch your breath. The other thing I wanted to talk about, though, while our audience is doing this, one thing I've heard from both of you guys so far is this spectrum of what an insider threat is. And so I think one of the things that organizations maybe have gotten wrong or could improve upon is that thinking that like a Snowden, a Schulte level event is the only thing that is defined as an insider threat. I'd really encourage you to broaden that definition so that you have things to talk about. Like a person sharing important corporate data to their personal email account in and of itself is an insider threat, right? Like they made a copy to an unauthorized system. Now it's not a Snowden level threat. It's probably not a breach. It all depends on like the laws that apply to that particular data type. It might be, but like these are the things that you can start having those conversations with to get people to see that like these policy violations, these non-malicious insider threats. I want to use the terminology that Shawnee is teaching us all. Like those matter when you're reporting, the severity or the breadth of the problem that you're facing. Now, one thing we've talked a little bit about like getting buy-in. We've talked about, the need for reporting. When we're thinking about like, kind of like where we're getting this program started, maybe we've done those things. We've got consensus from our leadership. People are bought in on that. We need to do it. We've shown them some reports. We're starting to think about like, well, how do I stop insider threats from happening altogether? Again, like we're working on our culture. Maybe even some mitigation techniques that people could do. And then let's think also about maybe we've got probably some clients on the line that have mature programs. Like how do they continuously improve? Just throw that at you guys, and either one of you, go ahead.
I think one thing that we haven't touched on is be best friends with your communications team. That is key, right? We could build things a lot easy. I mean, for us, right, being in the industry, we could push out policies, procedures, all that stuff, but you're going to lose everybody if they're reading some of this stuff and it's very technical jargon. You're going to lose everybody. So you got to start translating that terminology into plain English and talk to your communications of, hey, how do I set up a communication campaign to engage people? Are you doing any town halls or soapboxes to drive some of the programs that you're trying to build? So that is huge, right? And if something does happen, right, then you're going to go back to the communications team. If a breach happens, your CISO or anyone else, your CEO should not be out there talking to the media. You better run to your communications staff and ask them, how do you message this stuff out? So I think that is a key component of building this stuff out and then trying to get the word out.
I will add to harkening back to my spy days, when we were trained to recruit assets. When you're working with anyone and trying to get information, you want to put the benefits up front. What are the benefits to them? So it's that human nature that you have to leverage to what Riz was saying, right? What are the benefits to me, to my team, to have a program like this? Because oftentimes I've seen in a lot of organizations, people perceive toe stepping. I'm IT security. This is an IT problem, which is not, it's a human problem. But making sure, again, to piggyback on that whole working group thing, if you bring everyone in together and they can see it's one mission, one team, one fight, no one's going to feel like their toes are getting stepped on. Also, I think going forward and recognizing that you have to start somewhere. Programs like this, because there is such a perception of toe stepping and trying to understand what it is and whose role it fits in and who does what, you have to redo processes, you have to redo like who triages what, all of these pieces. So taking baby steps is really the best way to do it. So you're not, rocking the apple cart, or you're not upsetting people too much, and they get that buy-in to help participate and help build it themselves.
And when we think about like, the assets that we're trying to protect, you guys generally recommend like, protect everything from an insider threat, to prioritize things based on some kind of, risk assessment, or, like what is it that we should be trying to keep, protected from an insider threat?
Shawnee hit it earlier in the discussion, right? You better have a good data classification policy so you know what you're protecting. So security is expensive. You're not going to wrap this stuff around everything. I'm certainly not wrapping things around marketing, material that's out there, or some public analysis that we've done that's publicized, right? So what are your keys to the kingdom? What is most damaging to your company if that stuff gets out, right? Like, for example, Coca-Cola, I mean, their recipe gets out, it's game over for them, right? So You start wrapping out security around your critical data sets and then go from there. And that's a good place to start. Another thing is data retention. Get this stale data out of your environment, right? In our prep meetings, right, the analogy that I use is if you haven't worn a sweater in the last 5 months and it's in your closet, you go in there and your wife or your husband or your spouse is telling you to get rid of it. Like, yeah, I'm not going to wear it next week. You're not going to wear it. You haven't worn it for the last 5 years. So get it out of there, right? That limits your risk footprint and it's less expensive, right? Storage is expensive. Your data keeps growing. So if you don't need it, get it out.
Riz, you got to get out of my closet. That's not cool.
Yeah, and we did not make today an ugly sweater Data First Forum Day, though if we can convince our host to have a Christmas edition, maybe we could do an ugly sweater Christmas edition Data First Forum. I'm sure that Ashley and Haley are out there listening and eagerly thinking of the title for that one. Now, I want to pause. We've gotten a number of questions that have come in the chat, and I know we have one more topic. We want to get into like the advice section, but before we do that, or maybe even just to kick it off, Keith, one of our audience members asks, how can someone be more proactive with the concept of privilege management and the least privilege principle? Like, how can someone do better with that?
You got to start going through. I mean, that all goes back to your role-based access control model, right? And you better have a nice integration with your HR people. So when you're onboarding, offboarding people, what department are they going to be in? What is their role? What's their title? To start really locking down on the access and roles that they have in the company, right? So if you're hiring an HR analyst, I hope they don't have system admin rights, right? Or root administrative passwords to, I don't know, a SQL database on the back end. So it has to be driven through HR. They tell you their roles and responsibilities, and then from a technology and security perspective, you have to enforce it. So you start there. Identity management is very, very difficult, right? Especially if you're such a big company, done mergers and acquisitions. How do you integrate? You got identities all over the place. You may have MFA that's different from another part of your organization. So it's a heavy lift, but I think once you start integrating your stuff with HR, it'll get a little bit easier.
And I'll add to that too, making sure that you're working with them to scrub lists when people switch roles or when they leave the company. And everyone's like, oh, duh. But I can't tell you how many times I've had investigations where someone has switched a role and has continued accessing really sensitive data that they had no need to know in that role. Or when people get terminated or they quit voluntarily, very often they're just kind of left on lists.
And I want to read one of the points that came in from one of our audience members and launch another poll before we jump into our last section on advice. So Glenn says, create meaningful narratives the audience can relate to and those acceptable user policies and behaviors. We deliver corporate security forums with cross-representation, HR, IT, IG, audit, business relationship managers, members. And so it sounds like the more that we make this culture apparent, and we talk about like what is good behavior or what is expected of employees, that can lead to a lot of the good things as well. And then Charles adds in, hire a chief data officer. I mean, it's pretty good advice, especially if you think, we need to do better with data retention. We need to do better with, access to information. We need to do better with identity management. Those things could all help out. Could all help out with that. Another person adds in just, having that kind of working relationship between the onboarding and offboarding. It seems like, Shawnee, somebody must have been listening to you from earlier that, onboarding and offboarding, there's often a lot of gaps on insiders there.
So these are onboarding and offboarding are like the two main key touch points. And you have to look the whole employee lifecycle management from recruitment, making sure that you are advertising that position 100% honestly and accurately, because if for some reason someone can't have a cell phone at work and that's not known up front, they're going to be very angry when they start that job, and that disgruntlement is going to continue. So recruiting smartly, recruiting people who are a good culture fit for your organization. And remember, we've talked about culture already, but you might and probably should redo and review what your culture is. There could be a 2.0 or a 3.0. Take feedback from people. Okay, so you have people, you've recruited them. Then when you onboard them and you're doing those cultural interviews, you put them through training. You get that first buy-in where like, hey, we take security really seriously. Here's how we do it. Then throughout their employment, from recruitment to development to retention, investing in their well-being, organizations need to assign mentors, and mentees have programs like that. There are massive statistics out there where organizations who have those programs, mentorship programs, have like 70 or 80% less turnover, things like that. Like they really make a difference. Offering training for personal development, for professional development, not just what's in their role. So you're showing that you're invested in your employees' well-being, not just, hey, we want you to do a good job at your job here. And then with termination, remember, if someone has walked down that critical pathway and they're disgruntled or they're frustrated or whatever it is, if that termination is not done thoughtfully, if they've suddenly lost access and they couldn't say their farewell email, which gives people a lot of closure, interestingly, that can be a trigger, and sabotage is very common after things like that, especially people who are in IT roles. But you have to be very careful with those touch points, and those are all opportunities to mitigate your human risk.
And I want to talk about one thing that Shawnee said there that I've had personal success with in the past. And this is actually related to another question asked by Keith, which is kind of telling the difference between someone that's had a change in behavior versus just someone who's maybe quiet or introverted. And one thing that Shawnee just mentioned was like arrivals and going and all these employee wellness programs. And so one thing that I saw as a good strategy in the past was we often think of insider threats as how do I identify someone as risky and then incrementally increase their risk score over time, right? They maybe looked at a job site. They are starting to take unplanned PTO. They're starting to access information that they don't usually do. They've expressed to their manager discontent. These are all things that we all think are individual little red flags. It's just as important in these programs that you have green flags. Oh, this person is participating in employee wellness programs. This person just referred someone to our company. This person is doing all these other things, because sometimes when you're trying to spot the difference between someone who's just quiet or introverted or someone who just isn't as invested as you versus someone who's an insider threat, it's looking at both the negative behavioral indicators, but also the good and positive behavioral indicators that can help you find the person that sticks out that's just got a lot more negative than positive.
And I would say also those people that your green flags, use them to be security champions, right? Use them, help them spread the word.
Yeah, it's Shawnee just hit that too. Let me go back to the one topic of, you should have a chief data officer. That's all good, but also, there's budgets too, so you can't keep loading up on top. This is where you start identifying data owners and data stewards, and then right what Shawnee just said. Then you start bringing in your security coordinators, your security stewards, because at the end of the day, right, security is everyone's responsibility. And I always try to message out, you guys are closer to the front lines than I am. So you're going to know more about your environment that you work in every day. So if you see some sort of anomaly, call it out, and we could help jump in and support.
And
go ahead,
sorry,
Shawnee.
Matt, can I on the introvert point too? I think it's really important. And I mentioned this earlier, but having someone, I'm an introvert, believe it or not. Having someone,
I don't believe it, but I'll let you go.
Having someone be an introvert is okay, right? I mean, we're great, but you have to monitor for a change in pattern of behavior. So if that person is one way all the time and suddenly their normal is flipped upside down, that's your red flag. That's when you need to report or be concerned or investigate or just start exploring what's going on.
Riz, anything you want to add on there? Otherwise, I'm going to tack one of the things that got our audience really excited in the chat was Matt chimed in. We have trouble with people moving to another job within our organization, but still needing to do some access of their old job. We need a better process to follow up and set a date to remove access from the old role. We've even thought about them having other user accounts for that. And I think that this bigger thing that you're talking about, which is as people move through the org, they tend to accumulate privileges, not lose privileges. It's a common struggle. I mean, I think my general advice, if you're trying to tackle that entirely manually, it's going to be really hard. There are places where there's a good need for automation. And entitlement management is definitely one of them. Privilege management is definitely one of them.
Yeah, and in that case too, Matt, you got to have some sort of policy where yeah, we understand you're transitioning between, orgs within the company. You have 30 days, right? Something like that. You work with your HR partners and even the hiring managers at that point, saying this is not sustainable. A good example is when I came into my organization here about a year and a half ago, we had some shared drives out there, and we're a research organization. Everyone had access to everything. We had salary data in there and all this sensitive stuff. And we start locking this stuff down, and Shawnee knows like the culture of resistance to change, and it's like a mutiny on my hands where people are like so upset. I'm like, just slow down here a second. Like, do you need access to all of this? And start having those conversations. But you at the end of the day, we got to have a backbone, right? You got to push back and do the right thing and call it out. You got to call it out. Say, hey, this is not the right thing. This is not a standard. Like our competitors in the space are not acting or behaving this way, and we're gonna be called out, whether it be a whistleblower or some sort of data leak. It's gonna happen. It's inevitable. But you have to push back, and this is where your partners at the executive level and your managers really, really matter to get behind you and support your agenda.
I think this is one of the hardest parts about working in security, is this topic we're talking about, because it really requires a balance of like two things in a scenario.
Yeah.
One, courage, right? Like the willingness to speak up. And we look at these like CISOs in the headlines. This is what our topic of our last Data First Forum was about, right? Like under intense scrutiny, they've got business privileges they're trying to balance with like doing right by security. So courage, right? Like the willingness to speak up. And the second one is empathy, right? Like sometimes people are having a shitty time in life and they are not an insider threat. And just assuming that is just as detrimental to your brand and your culture as, like raising the flag and missing it, And so I think there's like a bigger element of this, like being good to people and, having empathy, but also having the courage to speak up and know that you might be wrong. I think that's just a part of working in security from my standpoint.
Oh, it's a good call out. Empathy is everything, right? Where I'm saying call it out is meaning have a good professional conversation. Explain to them why you're doing it, how it benefits them, how their job's going to get more secure and safer, right? And you got two wars going on in this world, right? There's a lot of evil. So at the end of the day, I tell this to my team too, is just please be kind to one another, right? And once that kindness will then start oozing out, and you'll start seeing, that cultures will shift pretty fast.
I always also say, think about the optics,
Yep.
Like if you do some big thing, you move a bunch of data, you exfiltrate a bunch of data, you change a bunch of stuff, and it looks like a bad thing, you shouldn't be surprised if someone comes to you and says like, hey, what's up? And I think, these are some of the ways that people can get started. So let's jump into our last segment before, and I think we probably have maybe one more or two more polls. I'm not sure, Haley, keep me honest. But really what we wanted to end on, and I know this could be spray and pray here, but like, let's give people some advice. Let's give the people what they want. They want to know some tips, some tricks, the things that have worked for you. You can be as specific or as broad as you want. And we can even, talk about, I don't remember if it was Riz or Shawnee was talking about Marie Kondo and the organizing things. Yeah, maybe it was Riz. Maybe you want to start there.
I don't even know how to follow up right there, Matt. My best recommendation here is what I generally do is try to build relationships out of the box. Any organization I'm part of, that is 100% key, and that's the only way you could do anything from to build anything, right? So build your trust, and things will fall into place from there. And then come up with the strategy too. Like I'm sure Shawnee will hit this in a second too. Is once you build that trust, do a gap assessment, see where your environment is, and then address those gaps. Do you have any compensating controls? Do you need to mitigate anything? Are you going to accept the risk? Right. That's certainly a good option to take if your risk appetite allows you to do that. So, but I think it always starts with people, and then get some good sound processes in place, and then you bring in your technology like a Varonis, right? You can start seeing a lot of data that may be being transmitted, stored, or processed, in the middle of the night when it shouldn't be. So the technology will always be your backbone, but you got to start with the soft areas. Use your EQ, right? It's not always the IQ. Even when you're hiring people, right? I hire a lot of people in the tech field. You get 1 hour to talk to them, and that's not enough. But my whole mantra in the back end is I probably most likely would not pick the most techie person. Shawnee hit it. You pick somebody that's going to fit within your culture, and everyone's trainable, right? I just need a good heart that's in the right place, and I'll train you up, and you're going to be very, very successful if you kind of follow that methodology, right? So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Riz.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Riz said. I know we've hit culture a lot, but just recall that it goes both ways. They have to be a good fit for you, and you have to be a good fit for them. If one of those doesn't fit, disgruntlement will ensue on one side or another. So what can people do? I would start with a human risk assessment to find out what tools you have in place. What can you use to build a program that you already have? You don't have to start this from scratch. You probably already have stuff that can be used. Find out what you're doing well and what you need to improve on. Work on policies, governance, make sure you're ticking all those boxes. Training and awareness. Constantly, I will say it again, you have to have training and awareness. And I don't mean once when you're onboarded, maybe once a year, someone has a really horrible PowerPoint that they click through. Be creative. Think about different ways to get people thinking outside the box, because you want engagement. Leverage things like everyone does phishing simulations. They're overdone. People are tired of being tested. If you think outside the box, try to do create your own. Who can create the coolest, most realistic phishing email? That way you're getting, use AI. You're getting people to learn about new tools. You're getting to learn, people can learn how these things are done and created. They're thinking like the bad actors, right? Leverage pop culture, the Oscars or National Insider Threat Awareness Month. Use things that are going on in the world to tell the story of why it's important. Case studies, case studies, case studies, be it in your company, in your industry. It doesn't even have to be in your industry. There are just a lot of really good case studies, and the FBI has been really great about publicizing some of these really cool, sexy cases. People, we like to be entertained nowadays. Make it entertaining. That really is going to be integral to getting the buy-in globally within your organization, but also starting to get reporting and getting awareness.
Yeah, I would also say, hire Shawnee to come and talk to your company or advise your company about it. It's totally an option. We can include information on how to get in contact with Shawnee and Shawnee's people after the webinar today. Really do mean that to the Varonis audience, like a true expert on this topic. Another thing I always find, and I think, Riz, this really hits what you were saying about that, technical versus non-technical person, is surround yourself with people that care about your business. So what is the thing that makes your company profitable, and focusing on protecting that? Or where does the most regulatory risk come from, and focus on protecting that? Because just figuring out what those things are and looking at them, they're going to find people that aren't handling as best as they could. Whether it's an insider threat or not is yet to be determined. But that's a good place to spend your time to use these discretionary security dollars, whether that's actual dollars or hours of time. Now, let's pause here. I know we've gotten a bunch of questions have poured in. The Q&A is probably filled up while we've been talking. I think we should launch our last poll, and then we'll take a look at what's come in on the Q&A. If anybody's got any last minute questions, let's put those into the Q&A now, and we'll take a look. One that came in that we can talk about from Benjamin, which is, should we treat industrial espionage differently than other types of insider threats?
I will say yes. When you're looking at industrial espionage, you've got nation states at play. So you absolutely need to be working with the FBI and working on those cases together. I will also caveat that and say, every FBI field office is different in a sense. They're phenomenal. I've worked with them a ton. I think they're amazing, but some cases might not meet the threshold for what they can take on. So the best thing you can do is give them as much evidence as you have with a big red bow, and just let them do their magic. But those cases absolutely should not be kept in-house. They need to be referred out.
To that point too, let me just add, join these ISACs that are out there, right? The Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So you could share some of that data in a nice, secure, safe space, right? And then, to Shawnee's point, you start engaging the FBI and give them everything. At least that first step will help parse some of that data out, with your partners in the industry, so they're not so overwhelmed and, getting too much data that they're not even going to react fast enough for you.
Yeah, and I want to echo the sentiment from John in our chat around working with the FBI, working with your local cybercrime division. I was just in Boston at a conference yesterday where the FBI came and gave a talk on doing exactly that. And of all of the different types of insiders, industrial espionage, things that have to deal with let's say things that are really tied to GDP. These are all really great stuff. Like the FBI cares a lot about it. They want to help you to investigate those crimes and see if maybe there's like a foreign actor involved, or if it could be bigger than just this one employee that you have. And oftentimes, law enforcement has more tools and more reach than you probably do, unless you're like a mega company. You probably are going to benefit from working with the FBI. Now, another one that came in, and I want to tackle that one too, which is, this one more has, and Riz, I'll throw this one at you, which is there anything that we can do with offboarding when we have bring your own device?
You got to have a good mobile device management policy and that technology in there. So you got to have that so you can start remote wiping their apps, right? So hopefully they're not processing company data on their own personal apps. So whatever you're giving them as far as your personal device, you better have company apps that are in their secure container so you can control that remotely. So that's just my advice, right? And just know what's in your BYOD policy, right? So just know what they can use, what they're not allowed to use, what data they're even allowed to have on their personal device too. So it goes back to your data classification and your other acceptable use type AUP type policies.
You can also throw in working with HR, making sure that your HR teams have an out processing checklist that's identical. Everyone uses the same one, and ask outgoing employees those questions. Do you have any data saved, on your personal phone? Have you ever emailed yourself company data? Have you ever saved anything onto a USB device? Those are ours now. You need to give them back. But if you don't ask those questions, no one's going to volunteer that information.
And only because I'm sure our marketing host might beat me to it if I don't do it now. I also wanted to add in just some advice for all of our viewers. Varonis does offer a free risk assessment completely tailored towards insider threats. Today's session was not to talk to you about it and all the value that it's going to bring your organization. But if you are looking for a place to start, you're looking for a place to mature or enhance, and you're interested in that, you can just drop your email or just a message right now to the hosts and panelists and saying, hey, follow up with me about that risk assessment. And someone from the Varonis team will be on to help you with that. We do specialize in that, and we help our clients with stuff like that all the time. My closing notes, just to get us wrapped up, because we're coming up on the top of the hour, is I'd like to ask our audience to just throw some cheers, throw some awesomes and some smiley faces in the chat for our two co-panelists today, who are absolute rock stars and titans in industry.
Thank you. We love emojis.
Hey, Matt, real quick though, on that point, we did use you guys as our, by the way, we're a Varonis shop. And how I got Varonis in there is we did that risk analysis and the gap assessment. And then I held an entire technology day, and I had you guys come in and in real time show the report to my entire enterprise. And there were jaws that were dropped. And the next week we had Varonis. So that's how that works.
Well, thank you for the plug, Riz. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you, our audience. You guys are what make the Data First Forums possible. We try to put together an all-star cast, but ultimately it's your attendance that drives these and keeps these happening. So thank you guys so much for coming. For those of you that are wondering, we will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording and all that stuff. We really appreciate you being here. I'm sure that we'll have to this topic's got people going so much. We'll probably have to cover it again sometime, and I'll ask our marketing host to note that. But yeah, thank you guys. And any closing comments from you, and then we'll say farewell.
I'll jump in, and I just want everyone to understand that the most important thing you can do is understand that it can happen to you, it can happen to your organization, and to take the steps to mitigate. You're never going to be able to mitigate everything, but there is a lot you can do to help lower that human risk.
Yeah, and just to add to that, walk around and ask other people in other departments, what do they do? And how are they working? You know, what data are they handling? So get to know the business too. That's the only way you'll know what you're protecting and securing.
And I'll close with be like Shawnee, and care about the human factor and the social factor. Be like Riz and get a Varonis data risk assessment.
And clean your closet.
Yeah, and clean out the sweaters from your closet, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.